does it feel safer, or are you really putting yourself out there and are just uncomfortable but doing it anyway?
It's probably a little bit of both. And I love how you're interviewing me now. So let's get started. Meg, it's so good to have you. Speaking of meaningful conversations, you've always been someone that has inspired me as a human, as a leader, someone that I've learned a lot from, although we didn't get the chance to work together for too long at SAP. But let me start with just where does this podcast find you?
Yeah, so I am in the Bay Area, and I am actually a fifth generation Bay Area native. So this is my home, if you will. But the other thing that's sort of different about me is that I'm first generation in my family to go to college. So while I'm from the Bay Area, not only am I first in tech, but I'm really the first in anything that's not a blue collar job. And so I have been kind of an outsider my whole life, while also being more deeply connected to this place than most people in tech. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
I have so many questions because I'm also today in Silicon Valley. I'm actually in Palo Alto as we're recording this, and just had some really interesting conversations because before Silicon Valley was Silicon Valley, right? It was not that. It was, and a lot of the architecture still kind of points to that. How has that shaped you? So this upbringing, where you come from, and then in now being one of the leading tech executives in the space that you're in. We'll get to that later.
Yeah, I would say that. So, I had a very non-traditional childhood. My parents were divorced probably, I think I was around 6 months old. I have lived in multiple contexts for a variety of reasons, and I've had a really complicated history. I'm going to write a memoir someday, and I just like to encourage everyone to know that it is a comedy, not a tragedy, but it is a complicated story. But I would say that, like, early on, I spent a lot of time trying to hide the fact that I didn't really fit in, that I didn't really belong. And what's fascinating is it never really occurred to me that the difference for me was gender. I didn't come to that understanding until much later. For me, the difference was class, for sure, and age. I started, I graduated high school 16. I started really young. I was constantly trying to fit in. And I think, just like anyone, when you go on your life journey, you realize that is helpful to a point and then becomes not helpful at all, because fitting in isn't actually what the world needs. The world needs for you to bring your full differences to the table, because that's where the interesting stuff happens. And so in my own journey in trying to fit in, one of the things that I developed early was the real kind of trying to understand where others were coming from, trying to get good at understanding language and nuance and cultural differences, but I didn't internalize them as cultural differences until much later when I started working with other cultures. And what I find is that I have skills that are typically true in immigrants, people that come from a different background and have a different life starting point and then come into a different culture and environment. And what you find, especially in tech, where there's need for innovation and different ways of thinking, the ability to pull from multiple sources creates different insights and also gives you different ways to bring those insights so that others can understand them, because you learn how to communicate cross-culture. You learn how to understand what people know and then how to bring your idea forward in that. And I think that is the true gift of being an outsider that I didn't fully appreciate until probably quite recently.
That's beautiful. And certainly a lot of that resonates. For me personally, being both an immigrant into the United States and in tech, and, having worked with people from all parts of the world and, leading them, building teams, which brings me to one of my first kind of big questions I had for you. You have been, and I already kind of briefly touched on that, you have been an executive, a leader in big tech companies, from Oracle to SAP, where we met. You've been an investor, a board member, you work with startups as well. I'm first and foremost interested in your assessment of where we are today in both the tech world, but also because it's so intertwined at this point in time, also in the world in general, especially given the perspective you just shared from your own life journey so far.
Yeah. So I'll just start by saying I'm actually an optimist. I really do like to look at the world in the frame of possibilities. So that's my natural state anyway. But I recognize that this is the most interesting time. I feel like my whole life has been building up to this moment. I'm sure you feel somewhat similar, and a lot of people do, in observing change. I started out my career in tech, and I was an engineering leader, and it was all about like platform change and architecture change and technology change. And then I got further in my career and it became more about market change and opportunity in the spaces of innovation. And now I'm reflecting and rethinking everything as it relates. And it's not just this like sort of surface area. AI is going to take all the jobs, and, the world is coming to an end, and enshittification is going to be the future and all of that. I mean, like all of that is our inputs. But what I truly believe is that we're at a moment where that is the first time that we're hitting all layers of the stack, right? Investors, board members, executive teams, technology teams, people at home, people in the office, people not in the office, but working. Like all of these places are uncomfortable, right? Uncomfortable because everybody can see a lot of stuff is happening. No one can fully get their arms around what that means for them. And there is the intersection of fear and interest, enthusiasm, and, I like to think about like uncomfortable is the place where we grow the most. Uncomfortable is the place where interesting things happen. And, I'm here for it, right? I really, really am here for it. But I also feel like in being here for it, I have a very unique point of view that it is on us to find a path that really values and amplifies and grows the human parts of all of this, what is next. Because without our humanity, we will create unnecessary suffering, because all of the things that are good create a need for change at a pace and a rate that is probably not consistent with our evolutionary processes.
Yes.
And so we as humans need to really appreciate the fact that discomfort is important, but it is we have agency to think about how this future happens, and we don't have to be completely lifting our hands and saying, oh, well, it's all just going to happen to me. We need to take that agency and make something happen for us.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. The agency part especially. I was just starting to kind of sketch out another one of my newsletter articles, because I started to realize how we talk so much about agents in the context of AI and technology, but so little about agency, right? On the flip side of that, there is this narrative of this is just all happening to us and there's no way for us to stop it or change it or influence it. But in fact, it is, right? We made this technology the same way we made all the other technology over centuries before. So I love that aspect of agency and really changing the lens and say, okay, how do we use all of this for the good of humanity to empower humans? And that still means change and discomfort, but it's a very different change and discomfort than the one where things just happen to you, which is one of those things you might not actually know, because I think we never talked about it, but your organization that you led was one of the first times where I encountered a focus on human ingenuity. I don't know if you remember that, but you probably do. But I was so fascinated by the fact that, you led that organization that was so focused on figuring out what it takes to get an organization to really embrace and foster and drive human ingenuity, especially in HR, which is not typically how HR is understood in the context of companies. So I'd love to hear a little bit more on your thoughts on, leadership, business leadership, HR, and this perspective that you just shared about how do we shape organizations for the future now that all of this stuff is changing?
Yeah. So a couple of analog kind of correlations. So one of the things I observed working in a big company, and I have to really be careful because it's like fingernails on a chalkboard for me. But when people would say upper management decided, did, said, whatever, and I get it that there is a context in business, no matter where you work and no matter how big your organization is, there is a context that might not feel aligned with either your personal values or your personal objectives, right? And so whether you're in, my biggest experience is, of course, you're in engineering and you think you want to have more investment in an area that you care about, but the people in charge of growing the business and finance know that the investors won't, will not value or support that kind of
Mm-hmm.
investment, right? That's like a really sort of obvious. And so it becomes this sort of like nebulous, someone else, this upper management is making these decisions. And I, as an individual, have no agency, no control. And therefore I am yielding all of my capability to just say, it's out of my control. And so I don't want to dismiss that there are a lot of things that we cannot control. And
Mm-hmm.
there are forces and demands and expectations that we may not even personally understand or we may not have control of. But one of the things that I have always believed, both as a leader and as somebody bringing innovation into the world of human development and human capability, is that the space between what you can't control and what you can have an impact on is often limited by your own definition of what value you can bring. And I think this is so important to really ground on this as we think about all of the stuff we can't control, like whether AI is, taking over our jobs or our privacy or our creativity or our art or all of these things. Yes, there's a sphere of things that you can't control. But the space that you can is bigger than you tend to believe. And so when I think
Mm-hmm.
about the function of HR, the role of parts of the organization that are supposed to be facilitating the agenda of talent and people towards the goals of the organization, I believe two things. I believe that the space that that group needs to be part of is bigger than the space that they've typically given themselves control over. And I also believe that the path between that is not selling their agenda, but investing more in understanding the overall business and customer need and then asking themselves, how can they serve in that space? And so I think that's the trick for everything, right? Understanding more your stakeholders and the context under which you're part of something bigger than yourself, and then asking yourself, what can I do differently to have a bigger impact towards that? And so that requires both curiosity and it also requires intellectual humility, because most of us have an idea of what the answer is already, without truly comprehending what the need is of our stakeholders. And so I think that's the piece in the middle. And it's both cultural, but it's also individual. Like each of us can work on this. And
Mm-hmm.
again, back to agency, to me, like that matters. Nobody can do that for me. I can do that for myself. And it's worth it for me to do that. It's worth it for me to pay attention and understand what's changing. Why is it changing? How do I need to show up differently? How do I need to exploit both my unique capability and the opportunity in service of something bigger than myself?
Yeah. One of the reasons I started this particular podcast is because I believe that over the next 10, 15 years and forward, companies and what we define as a company will look very differently. Because you touched on it very early, everything is changing across the whole stack, right? And yes, in fact, a lot of things that we do manually today, humans do manually today, will be automated. But also because since the Industrial Revolution, certainly we've built organizations and companies around this idea of making humans work like machines, right? It's all about predictability, output, high output management, all of that. And so there's a real existential question about what does a company look like in the future, and what do humans actually do in a company of the future, especially when all of these predictable, distant, high output tasks can be done by machines better, because that's actually what machines are really good at. So in the light of all of that, and going back to what you just said, how do you think leadership in the future of these organizations, people inside these organizations, will look like, so that we can create this environment that you just described so well? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think to me, I am most curious and most maybe a little bit concerned about the leadership side of this question. And I think so. The challenge in leadership is not, it's pretty nuanced. But to me, to be really good in this kind of middle space, this messy middle space where nothing is clear and opportunity is a little bit of everywhere and threat is a little bit of everywhere, to be good at that, you really need more curiosity and maybe less certainty. And unfortunately, back to the upper management says, like culturally, the definition of leader for most of us in our heads is you need to know, right? Your past experience is going to be what you lean on to know the answer to mobilize your team. And this creates an interesting dichotomy because it is unknowable and we're all learning at the same time. So leadership becomes much more about harnessing collective intelligence, exhibiting good judgment, modeling curiosity, modeling sort of flexibility in both emotional flexibility and executional flexibility, and being willing to give up some of the things you know to be best practice, right? Because there is no best practice. Anybody that says they have it, first off, there probably never has been best practice, but there always has been things as leaders that worked for us, right? So I brought in this person and I always worked with that person and I always had a team structure that looked like this and I always mobilized work in this way and that created my success.
Yeah.
But the problem is the things that are going to create your success in, going forward are definitionally going to be different. And so the vulnerability, the emotional vulnerability for leaders is exponentially higher. And it's not all on them. It's the entire organization. The entire organization expects them to know. So now you have your own ego challenges plus organizational pressure against something that's like definitionally impossible.
Right.
And so I think that what leaders need to build is confidence in something different. Confidence not in their playbooks, but confidence in their ability to piece together things they've experienced in the past in new ways. Right? That their agility should be where their confidence comes from, but that's not what we've built. And we've been, again, across our entire, our education system. So forget the world of work. Think about, we've built a generation of students that are great test takers, that are really good at doing something that they don't need to be doing anymore because machines are way better at remembering facts and spewing them back out again, right? And so these needs of independent thought, tests don't build independent thought, at least not today. And so again, we've now taken an entire pathway of what's the definition of success? How do you get into elite schools? How do you get out of elite schools? What do you do next? It's following patterns. And following patterns is the opposite of winning in this day and age. And so I really do believe that what leadership is going to need is very different. And it is about culture and it is about understanding collective wisdom. And it is about giving up a little bit of certainty and ego in service of learning. And that I think is going to be really interesting to watch. And I think you're going to see a lot more of the Jamie Dimons, spewing out the frustration, which again, I actually found really charming, I have to say. But the frustration, if you hear it in his voice, is really not about come back to the office, although that's how he's channeling it. It's about how do I lead in a time where people are not behaving in the pattern that I'm used to leading?
Yes, I think, a lot of that frustration is in fact probably also, really insecurity, not knowing how to lead in this very, very quickly changing environment. And I'm very biased, obviously, as a trained designer, but I think a lot about the creative act, the creative process, and the confidence that you build through discomfort, actually, right? Because a lot of the training is you need to learn to trust the creative process and your ability to figure it out, even though you don't yet see how it's going to be figure out how to build, right? But I think, you mentioned also critical thinking, if I, can paraphrase that, as such a core skill to develop going forward, because the playbook is no longer the playbook, right? And it goes not just a little bit off to the side, but it's almost like a 180 because of how drastic the changes are and the requirements are. And I love how you also talked about both the responsibility of the leader to, on the one hand, I guess, model the I don't know, but we can figure it out, through the collective intelligence. But then also on the flip side, the expectation that we have over a century now, basically cultivated inside organizations, that people are looking to the leader as the person that has all the answers,
right,
rather than having the collective confidence to say, no, we actually hold probably a lot of the answers, or fracture, parts of the answer that we will arrive at. So that's a really, really powerful, I think, perspective and realization. One of the conversations I've had for this podcast, I interviewed John Danner, who is a Berkeley professor, Wall Street Journal bestselling author. He wrote a book called The Other F Word, which is about failure. And so he interviewed people across the ranks on fear of failure, and how that's really probably the biggest holdback in organizations toward innovation and continuous evolution. When I hear you talk about this, it certainly reminds me of, at the end of the day, it is both very simple and very profound what's kind of underneath all of that, right? And that is that kind of fundamental fear of, I don't know the answer. I don't know where to go.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do think, so I'm coming to learn that the majority of the challenges are really about fear. So I love that you bring this up. And I don't think it's misplaced fear. I do think that in the past, opportunity and, definition of competence came from expertise and knowing things. Mm-hmm. And so it is a structural change that needs to happen. It's not that people are, definitionally not wanting to show vulnerability, but there's been a real penalty for doing it.
Yes.
And I think that a professional penalty, and especially in a certain type of leader, somebody that's been very successful and has had a long storied career. And I would just add one other little nugget, and that is one of the things that I've been investigating a lot lately in myself and in others is this concept of emotions as data. And so when you see an emotional reaction, which I love the Jamie Dimon one because it's recent and it's clearly an emotional reaction, it's useful to pull the thread and ask yourself, what is the real thing under here? Because our emotion is a way that we express something bigger. And I really believe that a big part of that emotion is exactly what you put your finger on. It is fear, and it is fear of what happens to me when what I'm good at is not valued.
Yes.
And what I'm not good at is expected. And that discomfort, you're going to see a variety of reactions to it. And I think there's going to have cultural elements and industry elements and, personal scars from middle school elements to all of this. All of us. But at the end of the day, I think this is the nugget. If we think about ourselves as evolutionary beings, if we think about how we adapt and evolve, and I do believe we adapt and evolve well, I strongly believe that if we want to kind of learn and understand more, we should always pull the thread. Where are we seeing emotional reaction? And what's underneath that? And then if we really want to be help the world, we need to figure out a better way to scaffold between where we are and where we need to be. And here I think we can all help. It is not good for someone who is experiencing fear and an emotion which shows up as anger or frustration or whatever. It is not good to double down on what they're not. It is always best for all of us. We all learn better when we're in a space of psychological safety.
Yeah.
And when we feel comfortable expressing vulnerability. And so I think we need more spaces for experienced people to develop together, to be able to express insecurity and fear, and to build some skill around the idea of how to transition from knowing to being curious. Truly believe this is a space where there's opportunity for new people to come in, and whether that's an HR partner or whether that's a career coach or whether that is some sort of leader within the organization, a chief of staff, a president, COO, whatever that needs to be. Each of us will benefit a lot by finding spaces where we can express our complete confusion and things we don't know and all of the things that are broken within us to a safe space that can help us brainstorm and learn and adapt and build new skills. Because without that, we're going to have a whole lot of negative vibe out there that needs a place to go. And so I really feel like this energy of fear needs to be transitioned to an energy of learning. And in order to do that, you need true psychological safety. If we can do anything like kindness and more hugs, telling people it's going to be okay, their jobs will go away. We got to quit telling them it's going to be fine. There'll be more jobs. There is going to be more jobs. Also, their jobs are going away, but we believe in them. They can do it. It's not going to be done alone. It's going to be done in groups and collectively. And we're going to make it. We're going to get there. And I think that's why my optimism is really aligned to, we need to show up for each other more, not less in this moment.
Yeah. And I share that optimism because I truly believe, we're born creative. I think the reason why this topic of human ingenuity resonated so much with me was because it's inherently human. We can, in fact, create and we can figure things out. But it actually starts with, as you said, with that acknowledgement of reality, being honest with ourselves first and foremost about what are these underlying emotions, and then channeling that into a creative act. And I really mean that in terms of coming up with new ideas that make the world, the organization, the tiny little thing that we do on a daily basis a little bit better for ourselves or for others around us. And, that part I think is really interesting because we're training it out of people. Being also immersed myself now in higher education, it's one of those things where you realize how much our education system needs to also evolve in order to foster what we're born with, which is the creativity and the ability to imagine and create worlds we want to live in, instead of training it out of us in service of producing predictable outcomes, as you said earlier, starting with tests and test results and all that kind of stuff, which is probably a good segue into what you are up to these days. I read one of your blog posts, which is titled Inventing the Future. I mean, everything you just said is sort of packed into that headline, the optimism, the willingness to create a better future for us to live in. So maybe tell me first and foremost about the future that you certainly envision. And then I have some follow-up questions for you on that too.
Well, first off, thank you for asking me. This is something that I've been sort of evolving towards for a while and realized that, so I just recently took a sabbatical, took some time off and goofed off. I actually recommend that highly. But in that space, I realized that this is a really important moment. This is an important moment, again, that I think warrants more scaffolding, and it warrants it across a larger dimension. And so when I ask myself, what role do I want to play in that? What is my purpose in that? And that's where I came to the, if not me, then who kind of moment where I said, the thing that needs to happen is something that I deeply care about. And so while I don't, what I love, I'm kind of motivated this way in general. Like I love having like a directional outcome that is bigger than how I understand how to achieve it, that requires me to grow into it, that gives me a lot of space for learning and curiosity, and then also has a real sort of activation underneath it. So something bigger than myself. And so this is where I landed on inventing the future. And what I mean by that is, and what an well-invented future would look like in my mind, is certainly one that leans on this things that we've been talking about, that the definition of success is adaptability and growth, not achieving a milestone, that the opportunity for contribution is expanded across all of the dimensions, not held within a small elite class. And that the value creation of this future is realized by a larger percentage of the population than just an elite class. In other words, I really believe deeply that if we are in this cognitive industrial revolution that Reid Hoffman is saying, then it's about what do we bring in your poets and thinkers, right? Like, how do we take what is unique and amazing about each of us, and how do we put that towards the purpose of the future? And recognizing that that has to encompass all of the hierarchy of needs, right? You can't just go out and be generous to the most creative and the most innovative. You really have to think about, how do we create economic stability? How do we create opportunity? How do we channel the passion and the skill and the strength of more brains into the future state of what we're doing? How do we get the right kinds of capabilities into our overall society to help people thrive? I believe, again, coming back to the beginning, I come from a working class family. I have done very menial jobs in my lifetime. I have worked with people and lived next to people of a variety of backgrounds. And I deeply recognize that there is a massive amount of untapped potential in the world. And so how we unlock more potential without compromising the need for economic growth and GDP growth and all of those other things, right? Like, how do we take this away from a zero-sum, winner-take-all kind of mindset and turn this into the power that we all need to bring our gifts forward? Again, this is not just about economic success. This is about human kindness and human capacity being fully realized.
Yeah.
And that can be big and small.
Yeah, I think that's so well articulated. And also, I think just the challenge kind of that was in that last sentence of economic growth by itself is meaningless, right? And it's certainly not the highest order bit, because we've seen how taken to the extreme where that has gotten us as humanity and the planet and that we live on. So even challenging that notion and pushing us as a collective to at least start seriously thinking about what other options there are, instead of just saying, well, that's just it, right? Like, that's the best we've come up with so far. I think that is exactly, certainly the reason for me to have these conversations, because the answers will not be going to, one of the things you said very earlier, will not be in one of our minds, right? It will be the collective conversation of people from all sorts of different places, perspectives, upbringings, geographies. And so that very much so resonates. What I loved about what you wrote, which already comes through, I think, just in talking to you, and I certainly have experienced you in the most positive way as a force of nature. And I think you even write this on your website, and I'll link to some really great writing from you in the show notes. But what you wrote, I want to read back and then see if you want to react to that. And that is, I'm not interested in incremental change. I want to see quadratic hypergrowth. I will invent a future that is abundant, expansive, and one that values our shared humanity, even the messy bits, which I thought was just so well written and put and so to the point. And when I read it, it's like, this is you in a nutshell, the way I've experienced you. So I don't know if you want to react to that, but if you want to expand a little bit on that, I think it would be great, because I think that is the kind of energy that is so needed.
Yeah. So two things underneath that. If you pop the link under the quadratic hypergrowth. This is the math that proves that when we talk about exponential growth, it's not true. So that's the nerd in me. So while I might not personally be that savvy in math, I value it when other people are. So I thought that was just fun. But setting that aside, the part that is deeply me is the messy bits part. I have long believed, and the longer I'm on the planet, the more I believe it, because you start to shed a lot of the things that don't serve you as you progress. It is the parts of ourselves that we might be slightly embarrassed about. So we started this conversation, with you talking about being introverted and not a native speaker. Those are things that you hold as a perspective about yourself and how you think that might hold you back. And yet, it's exactly that messy bit that makes you amazing in having conversations that are much deeper, that have a lot more richness to them, that make you more thoughtful in how you communicate. This is the truth for all of us. So just take anything that you're bad at, embarrassed about, confused about yourself, why you're not as good as others, whatever. Go deeper with that and say, what have you learned to do to either adapt around that, create scaffolding for yourself so that doesn't hold you back? How has it challenged you? Because it's in the challenge that you develop real adaptability skills. It doesn't matter what the challenge is. It's the adaptability skill that is the renewable resource here. And so if you quit again, it doesn't mean that you go around and tell everybody all the things you're bad at. I think I'm the only one that likes to do that. But it does mean that recognizing being bad at things is not only just part of the human condition, it's a necessary thing to develop skill.
Yeah.
To be uncomfortable and therefore learn to grow past it. And so this is why, we have to really honor our own messiness, because it's underneath that messiness that the fullness of who we are and what we can bring to the table is forged in that fire. And that's what matters.
So maybe last question before we wrap. So you're set to invent the future, and I think we need you to invent the future. What does the next step in inventing the future look like for you? Is there anything you want to share, talk about?
Sure. Yeah. So what I've been doing now, and it's both sort of feeding my curiosity and offering my give back. I've been doing a lot of independent advisory work, a little bit of keynote speaking and things like that, but a lot of work with CEOs, companies, starting from usually some specific part of the opportunity they're trying to address, go to market, portfolio, understanding potential investments or divestitures, or how to execute on something that might be an adjacency but not part of the core competency of the group. So sort of taking and pragmatically applying specifics that help just be a good thought partner, supporter, sort of someone who can bring both expertise and adaptability thinking to that. What that's giving to me is an opportunity to look at things from different lenses and different seats. And it creates for me a better picture of what, some of these amazing leaders are doing to sort of survive and adapt in this moment, which hopefully then creates that flywheel of pattern recognition, which is the thing that I'm actually good at, to help give more ideas of how do we structurally help. Because I'm super motivated to help right now today. How do we help our top leadership teams be able to survive what's expected of them going forward with confidence, but also with some intellectual humility? And so really, the more that I can kind of come up with and share ideas and practices that people can do that are both, pragmatic and also strategic, I think that's going to be a place where you can get the highest return on investment, both for where I spend my time, but also there's a whole, these people support big organizations who are having a whole lot of stuff going to happen. So the more we can work on that leadership tier to move past fear and towards opportunity, I feel like the better the current world of work will be. And probably, hopefully, the smarter I will be over time in observing and understanding these patterns. What are things that pragmatically work? Because at the end of the day, it's really going to be a lot about culture. Like, how do we build the right kind of cultures so that companies and individuals can adjust and adapt in the next 5 years? Because it's going to be a lot. And
it's gonna be a bumpy ride, yeah. But I love that.
Yes.
And everyone who gets a chance to work with you, I speak from experience, will be the better for it. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for coming on this podcast. I think I have a feeling, and if you're up for it, we need to do a second one at one point, and just check in, because there's so much I would love to talk to you about.
Well, then I would spend time with you anytime, any place, anywhere.
All right, that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you liked this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.